hours 30 GMT, ladies and gentlemen, or 14 hours in Cameroon. This is Talking Points of your #1 Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. Well, today we're discussing Africa's debt crisis. Many African nations in recent times continue to face the challenging sovereign debt situations, and according to the International Monetary Fund, and I quote, African states should point out that there is a fundamental problem with a sovereign debt restructuring process that only focuses on the contractual obligations of that debtor state owes the creditors. End of quotes. African faces a persistent need for more debt, even under normal circumstances, because the global financial architecture is structured to perpetuate the independence, or rather dependence, of the African economies on the economies of the global West. Indeed, Africa is being forced to become perpetually dependent on external debt, in spite of the fact that the terms associated with contracting such debt have increasingly become unfavorable to debtors and more favorable to creditors. This is leading to the emergence of a new spiral of unsustainable debt on the African continent, even after many countries benefited from the heavily indebted Poor Countries Initiative, as well as the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative. Indeed, the head of the African Development Bank, Dr. Kwame Adesina, has highlighted severally that Africa has what it takes to develop itself, and this was re-echoed by the Kenyan President William Samoei Ruto in Addis Ababa later this year. What avenues can be explored to effectively tackle Africa's debt crisis? Join us in the course of today's edition of Talking Points. Stay with us. Exploring effective parameters for tackling Africa's debt crisis. That is the question for today. We shall be analyzing this in the course of today's edition. Ladies and gentlemen, if you're just joining us, you're welcome on board. This is Talking Points, a weekly program on your Pan-African channel for you, Media Africa. You're watching us on 4U television, listening to us over the airways of FM 96.3 4U Radio, Pan-African Radio, and we should reiterate that we're streaming live on our respective or different social media platforms. So today we shall be analyzing this in the course of this edition, first and foremost with Dr. STANLEY FONGOD, who is a Pan-Africanist, joining us all the way from the US. Greetings to you, sir. Thank
you so much for having me, Sharon. Thank for my co-panelists for joining, and also those who are viewers, thank you for tuning in. I hope we have a fruitful conversation today.
Like you rightly mentioned, we've just been joined by Mr. Engineer ELVIS, BANEH, a political analyst, and we should recall he's equally the National Communications Secretary for the Popular Actions Party. Greetings to you, so you're welcome on board.
Good afternoon, madam. Good afternoon, doctor. Good afternoon to all viewers of 4U. It's a pleasure being on this platform again today.
So, kickstart with you, Mr. Engineer ELVIS, BANEH. Now, you've listened to the preamble. Now, in your opinion, how do you evaluate Africa's current debt situation?
Well, I would say it's catastrophic. Africa's debt situation as of now, I think, is catastrophic. Given that when you look globally, I don't think there is any African country that is actually free of that. This is not like to say that generally in the world, nations do not own. No, every country in the world has debt. But now, when we talk about Africa's own case, and of course Africa's case is what concerns us as Africans and as Pan-Africans, I say it is catastrophic because most often than not, they talk about debts that amount up to thousands of US dollars, billions of US dollars, but in reality, sometimes you don't even know when these different debts were ever contracted. You don't know exactly what was ever done with the fundings, the resources, the money that they got from the different funding bodies and other partner countries. So that's why I say it is catastrophic, because when you look back in these very African countries, you don't see the investments that could even give an iota of hope that through these investments they could be able to generate some sort of income to be able to pay back the debt we are talking about. So I think it is alarming as far as Africa is concerned, and even across Africa as a continent. And of course, with our topic for today, I think it is very, very imperative that we begin to come up and with ideas as to how or what we think can be done to be able to alleviate this particular debt crisis that we are facing. Remember that most often than not, it is the entire nation, it is the entire continent, it is today's youth who are tomorrow's leaders who have been mortgaged, you see, because there will come a time when we shall spend all our youth and lives paying for debts that we never knew how and when they were contracted, and that we can't even give an account as to how they were ever managed. Whereas those who contracted these debts, they are there today with us, and no one ever tells us exactly what has been done of these different resources. So I think it's a deplorable situation.
Immensely, Mr. Engineer Elvis. And over to you, Dr. Stanley, your opinion. How would you really evaluate the current situation which Africa finds itself in terms of its debt crisis?
I think, we're in trouble. And the reason why we're in trouble is primarily because, of the amount of debt that the continent actually owes. And so for us to understand the kind of trouble that we're in, we need to be able to understand the mechanism itself that has placed us in this situation. And also to understand the mechanism of the debt itself, because most likely than not, what we consider debt, okay, and the way the debt ratio is actually being calculated, it's a little bit quite funny. For example, if you look at a country like Congo, I think there are about 10 countries on the African continent that has, even 20 countries that has one of the worst, debt to GDP ratio, which is quite crazy. You have countries like Malawi, South Africa, Sierra Leone, Ghana, you have Mauritius, you have, I think Angola is in the list as well. And my favorite of all is actually Congo. Congo's debt to this GDP, gross domestic product, okay? So if you look at the debt of the nation to its gross domestic outlook or gross domestic product, it's about 91%. That's Congo Republic. So what you're seeing is that almost all of what Congo will produce per year, per annum, all of its gross domestic products, everything that it does, however you want to calculate, the GDP, there's so many metrics to which the GDP is being calculated, but however you want to calculate its GDP, you will realize that 91% of all of her GDPs goes to settle, her debts, which means that there's really nothing left for infrastructural development. There is almost nothing that is left for, healthcare services. There's nothing left for social services. Almost every single thing else goes to settle, a debt. What is the kicker is that if you think that 91% debt to GDP ratio is really high, that is really not even high, because if you look at a country like America, all right, America debts to its GDP ratio is actually 123%. That means America never produces, as much product per annum as her debt. So she is in more debt than actually the amount of money that she's making. It's like you imagine that you went and borrowed money from the bank, and just your interest alone, the amount of money that you make every single month is not able to pay the interest on the debt alone. You will never pay that debt. That's just what America is in, 123%. And this is I think it's a 3 trillion economy. All right, America is a 3 trillion economy, and we are dealing with 120% of our debt. So if you calculate that in relationship to African countries, you soon discover that America is actually in the worse situation than Africa. But why Africa? Of course, you have to understand two things. Number one, in developed nations, and you can look at the G7, which at the average, the G7, the 7 big boys, the average debt to income, the average debt to GDP ratio is about 128, I think, 128%. So they are not in any better position than most African countries so far as their debt to the GDP ratio is concerned. The difference is who is printing the money. who has control over the money. There's a lot of dynamics that goes into this whole entire setup in such a way that, yes, as my brother said, we are placed in a situation on the African continent where we basically are maybe put in a situation of servitude for forever. And obviously, we have people who do not understand these mechanisms, who came to power with no economic background, okay, with no background in finance. They just came to power and they elect people into positions that have absolutely no idea what they're talking about. And they go and sign us in debt, okay, debts that we cannot pay, debts in which we do not even know how to manage, debts to which it is that when we borrow this money, we basically think about a day of forgiveness that will come. And unfortunately, we can't forgive ourselves of our own debts like most countries can do. We are at the mercy of the International Monetary Fund. We are at the mercy of the World Bank. We are at the mercy of some countries with some benevolent outlook on Africa. But we still have these debts hanging over our heads where our children, great-grandchildren might not even be able to pay. You know, and if you ask those from these countries to which it is that they owe this debt, you know, they have nothing to say. I'm only reminded of the words of Lapiro, who said that every single day, I'm going to paraphrase Lapiro, you know, from Cameroon, the famous political artist. He said that 90%, he said that most often at times, there is this whole entire talk about national debt. I'm paraphrasing. It says that women are being taxed as BAM, Salams, those who buy and sell. It says everybody is being taxed to pay this national debt. It says he has 3 questions to ask. The first question is, how much do we owe? Nobody is saying anything. What is the interest on the loan that we owe? Nobody is saying anything. How much have we paid? You know, nobody says anything. And then he concludes like nobody else will say it. It says this is, in his typical way of saying it, this is graphic for faith. That means this is the highest 419 that actually does exist. This is just cookery, and unfortunately, that's the state in which we are in.
Exactly, the state in which Africa finds itself. And today, in the course of this edition, we shall be bringing to the table some suggestions that could be relevant in this current situation. Now, over to you, Mr. NJINE. You've heard your co-panelist with regards to what he had to say in his preamble. Now, do you think African financial institutions are capable of financing development projects on the African continent? Because we're well aware that this debt crisis definitely affects the development trajectory of the African continent. So how does this affect? And of course, are these institutions in Africa capable of leading Africa to where it intends to be? Mr. NJINE, are you with us?
Yeah. Sorry, my mic was muted. I was saying that without being an expert in economic affairs, I would tell you that I believe that the financial institutions we have on the African continent can be able to lead us to somewhere, you see. But the unfortunate situation, like my co-panelist already rightly said, is just the fact that sometimes the problem is not the money that is given, but how the money is managed. Sometimes the problem is the nature of the project in which the investments are, or the monies are invested. Projects sometimes that were poorly planned, and so sometimes you begin something and it's in the course of implementation that you get to realize that it could actually not yield any fruits. Now imagine you going to a bank, a financial institution, to get a heavy loan, and then you invest into something that was into a project that was poorly drafted from the onset. You realize that at the end of the day, you have a debt to pay back to that financial institution on an interest rate, whereas you have not gained anything out of it. I want to take a practical example. If you come back to the case of Cameroon, for instance, they will tell you that there are dams that have been constructed in this country to help in the domain of electricity, you see. But they will tell you it's only after the dams were constructed and everything completed that they tell you that in the course of drawing up the project, they forgot the transmission lines. It means that it becomes another project on its own, which looks like it is totally detached from the initial phase, where they now need to strategize on how to build the transmission lines before the people can have access to energy. So you realize that at the end of the day, the money that was brought in, the dams actually have been constructed, but the dams do not serve a purpose because you cannot transmit the energy from the dam to the final consumers. So that is the problem. Sometimes it's a matter of projects that are poorly drafted or poorly conceived. Sometimes it is just a matter of governance issues, corruption, embezzlement. People who get money, embezzle, they are not held accountable by anyone. They don't give accounts to anybody, and no one ever questions or troubles them about anything, you see. So I think that the financial institutions could actually lead us to somewhere, but the problem is the way we manage the finances at the end of the day and the nature of projects in which we invest. Sometimes we get into projects that are not a priority as of the time. Now, the second thing now is, when we even talk about financial institutions on the African continent being able to finance us as a people out of our present predicament, the question that my brother again asked is, what resources are we using? What money are we using? Who is the person printing this money? Because you cannot be a sovereign people and some other persons elsewhere in their own country, in their own continent, are the one determining everything about your economy and about your financial system. They are the one determining the rate at which maybe your currency needs to be matched up to other currencies around the world. All these are things that until we actually come up as a people and we put in place powerful institutions that can first and foremost defend Africans as a continent, and then secondly work on a 50-50 basis with the other external forces, it becomes a serious problem. Because at the end of the day, when we even talk about financial institutions in Africa, most often than not, they themselves are subjected to other international constraints, and these international constraints, believe you me, are all about political decisions that are taken to suit the interests of some other persons. So at the end of the day, we as a people, we end up being nothing but just the victims.
And Africa is the victim indeed. Now over to you, Dr. Stanley. You double as the CEO of Kristen FinTech. Now, with your expertise, could you enlighten our audience, our televiewers, as well as listeners on what accounts for Africa's current debt crisis?
Well, I think, I'm going to piggyback on what my brother just said. The reality is that, most African leaders run, their countries as if they say they're running a charity organization or to say that they are running a church. And this happens especially when you have countries where the public sector becomes, it basically takes over what the private sector is supposed to do. In a country that basically stands on its own, where the public sector, do not infringes on the rights of those in the private sector, where the private sector is actually encouraged, to produce goods and services within a particular country, that is how we change the whole entire outlook of a nation. We need to be able to allow the public sector, because the public sector, it doesn't matter whether that public sector is in an African country or the public sector is here, the federal system in the United States of America, they do not know what to do. It's a fact. The highest waste in America is actually when the government decides to do something, they mess things up. When you bring, resources into the hands of the private sector, people who are basically only interested in making profits, who are interested in basically satisfying the market, those are the people that literally, brings about development in a nation. But when you go into the public sector, you have people who, for example, on the African continent, who are unskilled, untrained, who have been elected to positions that they have no capacity to be able to handle, appointed because of, you're my brother, you're my sister, you're from my village, and all of that madness. And in the end, when you give them money, they basically do not have the capacity to be physically responsible. They do not have any responsibility to, the money that they are given. And so in that light, we are having countries that borrow money and they run that money at a deficit every single time, because making money out of that money is obviously not their primary objective. We heard about the situation my brother just mentioned about electricity in Cameroon. If you borrowed money and you said that you were trying to construct a dam, for an electrical project, and the whole entire stuff was supposed to produce the dam, and then eventually have the lines so that we can start selling power. If you only did the dam and you can't sell power, you still have to start paying interest on the dam. So you're paying interest on the loan that is producing nothing. Meanwhile, there are people who have eaten, a lion's share of all of that, because obviously nobody is going to come after them, and that's just the way things are. So we have to be able to become a little bit fiscally responsible. And I think that if we actually do that, where we allow the private sector to be able to be engaged in things that are meaningful, excuse me, and things that are meaningful, and allow them to be able to take care of things that they need to take care of, rather than having the public sector, you know, to come in and basically use power and, you know, favors from family members and friends. You know, that will mess things up eventually for everybody. But I think that we have to encourage the private sector to become more resourceful in the nation. Or most of these government projects in the hand of the private sector will make more sense. The private sector has the capacity to manage. Even at best, a para-governmental organization will be a best-case scenario where you can actually have an oversight as to what projects that we are doing, but in the end, allow the private sector to do what the private sector does best. They create jobs, they're innovative, and they change the outlook of every nation.
Exactly. Now, over to you, Ms. NJINE. I recall during the 13th ministerial meeting of the World Trade Organization that just ended a few days ago, we had African experts that decried the fact that African countries do trade more with Western nations, or say with the rest of the world, than they would with their neighbors on the African continent. And now, with that in mind, we are well aware that such bilateral cooperations will actually lead to a decline in the development or economic growth of the continent. And now, what's your own take on that?
You know, most often than not, they say charity begins at home. You see, and it comes back to one thing sometimes I always emphasize on. Until we begin to look at each other face to face, eyeball to eyeball, and we see in the other person a brother, a sister, then we are not making any way forward. If today we have leaders across the African continent who still believe that we can do better business with the Western world than with our own African brothers, I said there is a problem. There is a problem because already with that mentality, which to me is already handicapped, it tells you that these are people who will only go out there to sign business deals where the Western countries are more favored, and then secondly, they as individuals, they follow suit. You see, I would not like to continue citing my own country here, but we have seen situations where maybe in the mining sector, people come in because a foreign company gives to a handful of individuals a certain amount of hundreds of millions or billions. They will accept to sign out a business deal for that company, where in the space of 10, 15, 20, 30 years, they would have gained maybe 300, 400, 500 times their investment, when the state in itself is not even up to about 100% of profit from that same business deal. Why? Simply because the people were more concerned with their private interest than that of the state. So thinking that we can do more better business with the Western countries, to me, is not really feasible, because in terms of development, because I want to think that within the African continent, it is but very, very normal, possible, and practical that whatever thing it is that one country doesn't have in terms of maybe human and or natural resources, country B can be able to supply that. And so it simply becomes a matter of exchange, give and take. You see, and if we were to accept to do business amongst ourselves as African countries, you realize that generally it will be a little more cheaper within us. It will be a little more cheaper amongst us because, first of all, there will be that sense of brotherliness. You see, but now when you prefer the Western countries, I have often insisted on the fact that it is all about interest. These people come for nothing else but their interest, and their interest can even go for at 1,000%. That is all fine by them. So I think doing business with African countries is what we could rather try to encourage. You see, unfortunately, sometimes we talk, but those who are at the decision-taking side of the bench, they perhaps either do not listen to us, or they simply listen, and to an extent, it's just like pouring water on the deck's back.
And that would definitely be in line with the African continent of free trade area, of course, implementation. Now back to you, Dr. Stanley. Now, what parameters do you think could be explored for Africa to be able to say effectively tackle its debt crisis?
I think at this particular point, we have to find ways, just like you said earlier on, to make sure that we literally invest within ourselves. That means we borrow money from other African countries. And the only way for us to do that is to basically have our own currency. One of the biggest problems that comes as a result of, the crisis that we face with debt is this particular issue about foreign-dominated debt and domestic-dominated debt. So if you look at foreign-dominated debt, so foreign-dominated debt will be debt that is basically borrowed in a foreign currency, like the US dollar, like the Japanese yen, like the euro, the British pounds, and all of that stuff. So those debts are actually being serviced, or you have to pay those debts with those currencies. Then you have the domestic-dominated debt, which are debts that are borrowed and can be paid with local currencies. So, but here's the kicker. You can actually be able to control based on your own fiscal policies. You can do so many things within the country that can give you a fair advantage on, being able to pay your debt if your debts are domestic dominated rather than being foreign dominated. And if they are foreign dominated, then there's just little or nothing that you can do about it. And even the interest rates of those loans also basically changes as well. So the reality is we have to start, and you have to ask yourself this question, that we received foreign aid, all right? So let me explain to you how this works. You are saying you receive foreign aid in relationships to debt. That's exactly what most of these things are. So you have debt, and maybe you borrowed like 50 million, from the US dollar, from the US, okay, 50 million US dollar. And in the end, you received that particular money, and you are thinking that you have to first of all ask yourself a series of questions. What is the value of the 50 million in itself? What is its value? And the value of that money is, because it's the fiat, is whatever the US government said that money is valued for. They show up in your country, and then they collect, as a result of, and this is one of the reasons why it's so difficult for African countries to trade among themselves, because of the amount of money that they owe. They have to satisfy certain requirements, maybe in goods and services. So you have to now turn around and start exporting your natural resources. You're exporting gold, you're exporting iron, you're exporting lithium, you're exporting silver, you're exporting copper. Now, all of these are actually tangible things. These are things that in the past was used to back up every single currency. Gold was used to back up currency, so was silver. And silver and gold at some point in time was actually currency themselves. And so before the fiat system, which is basically fiat for the Latin, by decree, which just means that countries decided, we're going to print this money and the government is going to say it's worth X, and that is what it is. It's not backed by anything. So we have this paper that is printed in Europe, and then they give us this paper, and then they tell us that we owe them this so much amount of money, and then they come to the continent, and then they collect what it is that is of great value, which basically does not depreciate. You will not hear about inflation, you will not hear about any of that stuff, which is gold, and then they take that overseas. So they sit and they print paper, and then they tell us exactly the value of the paper, and they come and they collect all that we have, and they take overseas. Meanwhile, if Africans could just be able to create a single currency, and if that currency was going to be backed by gold, it will topple the dollar any day, anytime. It will topple the euro any day, anytime. The Japanese yen would disappear if Africa could just be able to back her currency with gold. We have the gold, we have the diamond, we have the natural resources to do so. And if only we did that, gold has this consistency, in terms of its cluster abundance, in such a way that there is no way we can ever doubt its efficacy when it comes to it being backed as a value of money. Gold is so good. We have to do whatever it takes to be able to make sure that we have a currency on the African continent that is literally backed by gold. If that was going to be the case, we don't have to worry about all of this madness in the name of debt from folks who basically created the madness on the continent of Africa in the first place, and then turn around and are borrowing us money that is actually ours, money that we worked for, money that was looted from the continent.
Absolutely. I would like to stay with you, Dr. Stanley. Now you evoke this issue of a common currency on Africa. Now, with this in mind, if the aspirations of a single currency on the African continent, do you think if it actually comes to a realization, it will be able to counter this, this situation of Africa's current debt crisis?
Absolutely, 1 billion%, because now we will be able to put money in things that we really need to put money in. Okay, local investors on the African continent will be able to actually get the money they need to invest. Most often at times, nations have to rely on foreign investors, all right? So when foreign investors are not coming in because maybe the debt of the nation is so high, we will not have that particular issue, because now there will be a lot of people who also want to invest their money on the African continent, knowing mindfully well that our money is absolutely good, that we have money that is not going, you know, don't have to worry about us printing money, because we don't just print money. See, we'll not be like United States of America where it just prints money because it can. We'll print money because something is actually backing that money up. So which means that we, the Africans, will basically have a currency that will be the first currency that will have to replace the dollar. Reasons being, this currency will be good enough for all financial transactions across the globe, knowing mindfully well that there will not be a day that somebody would actually collect money from you and then will be worrying if the value of the money will drop the next day, because it will not drop. Once ever you back up a currency, whatever that currency is with gold, you don't have to worry about any depreciation. Since the 1930s, the value of gold has consistently been going up, and we don't have to also worry about the amount of gold that will enter into circulation, reasons being that there's a certain cluster abundance of gold in the earth, and it is finite. It is not one of those things where it's an endless supply. We can always print. The reality is that at some particular point in time, we'll mine and we'll stop mining, because all the gold in this earth crust, you know, I mean, which is mineable, will be exhausted, and there's nothing else you can do about it. That's why gold is so critical to be able to back up the currency that we have on the continent. If we take these measures, everybody will be all right.
Adding up to what you said, Dr. Stanley, I'd like to channel this next question to you, Ms. NJINE. Now, do you think that multilateralism on the African continent, or better still, the implementation of the African continent or free trade area, could be effective, or could be an effective tool in addressing this current crisis?
Well, when we talk about the free trade area, maybe we should try to look at it and go beyond just the idea of goods circulating. You see, because actually we are discussing today about the debt crisis across the African continent and how to be able to step out of it. You know,
Exactly.
even if goods have to circulate among the different nations, but the issue is the current debt that we have as of now. How do we resolve the issue? And then in the when those goods begin to circulate, you see, the idea, the question that we could begin to ask ourselves is, could it not too, in one way or the other, incur other debts? You see, so the problem is not just the circulation of the goods, but I think that there is something far more beyond added to that we need to look at. First, I still come back to the issue of the currency that we are using. What currency do we use across the African continent? Shall we eventually have a unique currency, or we shall have to circulate these goods across the African continent when the different regional blocks have their respective currencies all dictated to us by foreign powers? That is where the problem lies, because they will still think of a means of fighting us back, even if we circulate goods within the African continent, because you will still circulate your own goods, maybe that you produce, but you sell them at a rate that they will be the ones to determine the prices for us. So those that is something we need to take into consideration. So the other way around, I would rather tell you that instead of focusing just only maybe on the African continental free trade area, I rather want to think that there is one other thing, or there are two other things I would have loved to mention here. I don't know if we were still to get to that, as to how I think we can be able to resolve the present debt crisis we have across the African continent. First, that Africa, when I talk about Africa here, I'm referring to the African government, the governments in place. We should stay clear of the IMF and the World Bank, because to me, these are two institutions that have indebted Africa heavily where we are right now. Because like Dr. FONGOD was saying, these are two institutions that will always come to you in the name of aid. That is the term they always use. They say they are coming to give us aid. Aid, we know at the end of the day, we pay financial sums of money to them without ever knowing exactly how much money was given, how much has been paid, or what interest rate is still or lingers over this sums of money, but they keep calling them aid because they brandish it in the public, in the eyes of the people, but at the background, they work at the background with the government, and we know what they tap out of the African continent. We need to stay clear of the World Bank and the IMF, because I do not see any country, except someone else could challenge me. I have not seen a country that has developed in the world thanks to the IMF and the World Bank. After all, if there were to be countries that have been growing thanks to these two institutions, Africa should have been a glaring example, because almost all African countries have been receiving money from these two institutions. But at the end of the day, we remain the most backward countries in terms of everything. Secondly, you come to think of it, madam, that the same people who give you money, IMF, World Bank, and they give it on conditions, they give it with respect to particular projects, at the end of the day, the same projects are not materialized, but they still keep giving in more money without asking questions and calling to book those who collected the first sums of money and never materialized the project. You understand, therefore, that their interest is not even to see you develop in whatever way. For as long as you can collect their money, embezzle it, mismanage it, and you eventually pay back to them with their interest rates and all what it takes, they are okay with you. Why? Because behind the IMF and the World Bank, of course, we know the different nations that control the parameters there. The next thing is that for the debt we already have as of now, for us to be able to step out of it, I think there is a need for some feasible restructuring. Those who have lended money to African countries, be they IMF, World Bank, they should be able to perhaps extend and give us a reasonable time frame when we can be able to repay the debt. Secondly, they should be able to review their taxes on the different loans that we have had. You know, the unfortunate thing again we keep saying is that at the end of the day, ironically, the money they give us is our money. We pay it back to them with exorbitant tax rates, and sometimes they even stifle the regimes in place with very short durations of time when you are expected to pay back these very loans. So I think that is what I had to give as contributions. But coming back to the issue of the African free trade, we have encouraged it. Let our African leaders try to implement it, but we need first and foremost our own currency to be able to do business smoothly amongst ourselves without having to have foreigners intervene in the whole process.
Exactly. Before I welcome this excerpt done for us by Dr. William Ruto, President of Kenya, I'd like to ask this last question to you, Dr. Stanley. Now, in your opinion, can the African continent or free trade area, having listened to what your co-panelists had to say, could it amplify economic equality on the continent, hence harnessing Africa's potential and pushing for what we call sustainable development?
Absolutely. I mean, he said it so brilliantly. And one of the things which, you know, I actually picked out from what my brother was talking about, you know, before I even get to answer that question, is this whole entire idea that, isn't it quite suspicious that whenever a country is, or the IMF or the World Bank, it's basically borrowing money to us, they tell us exactly the specific projects that we need to engage in. All right, but if you look at those projects, it's never for the overall good of the country. And of course, it makes sense. Why will a country or a group basically borrow you money, you know, to which it is that is going to set you free so that you don't have to come back and borrow money again from them? You know, that's basically not their objective. They want to have repeat customers. They work like pharmaceutical companies in America, where it's about to treat you just enough for you to get well, and then but create other issues, you know, in your life so that you just keep come back and you become dependent on the pharmacy. You become dependent on big pharma, you become dependent on them. That's how these things work. So the reality is we have to find ways on the continent where we can actually be able to start doing things for ourselves, by ourselves, and with ourselves. And if that was going to be the case, then you'll soon realize that those who are in Kenya on the Eastern Bloc, you know, that have resources that is needed in the West, if that is an open market, then those in the Western part of Africa can actually benefit from those in the eastern part of Africa, and vice versa. We can actually be able to literally sustain ourselves on the African continent with the resources that we have, and we don't have to look somewhere else, you know, especially to the west or to the east, because we are trying to be able to get things, you know, going. If you look at a country like Cameroon, we have a seaport in Kribi funded by the Chinese, you know, at what cost? what is the cost of that seaport in Kribi. There is a railway station that comes from inland from an iron ore and comes directly to the seaport, exporting all of our iron ore outside of the country. Meanwhile, all China did was send us machinery, printed a couple of money, all right, and then at the expense of us and our own natural resources being basically shipped out of the country. You have seen most of these Chinese companies that basically comes to work in Africa, and they come with their workforce. That simply means they print the money. They use the money on their own people, because most often at times it is them that are actually doing the work. They buy products from Chinese companies. So every single thing is actually still China. They come and then they install it in a place like Cameroon, and then they still loot the country of all of her natural resources. So in the end, there is nothing else that Cameroon actually has gained from this whole entire project, which means that they installed a seaport for themselves with themselves in mind, and to use it for their own project and then bill the country of Cameroon for it. That is some serious madness. We need to be able to open the continent for Africans and allow Africans to flourish across the board.
Exactly. It's all about making it very much conducive for development to push forward. Now, before we continue today's analysis, we were able to get this except during the just ended African Union Summit that took place in Addis Ababa, and we had the Kenyan President, Dr. William Samuel Ruto, that was expressing himself on the microphone of For You Media Africa with regards to the current debt crisis on the African continent. Take a listen.
We had a very candid conversation about Africa's multilateral development financial institutions. And we are saying the same way we are having a conversation about the international financial architecture, it must start with a conversation about the African institutions, whether we are talking about Afrexim Bank, Africa Development Bank, Trade Development Bank, and all the other institutions that are African. And we are making a conscious decision that, number one, we are going to capitalize these institutions. Countries like Kenya, for example, we have bought more shares in Afrexim Bank. We have bought more shares in Trade Development Bank. We now want to move it to scale up their capital so that they become more attractive, number one. Number two, we want to make these institutions agents or agencies of the African Union, to give them legitimacy, to give them recognition, to put a stamp of approval on them that they represent our continent. And much more importantly, we are making a conscious decision that we want 30% of all our reserves that today are in all manner of banks, in all manner of capitals, to be in these institutions so that we give them legitimacy. Number two, we are not leaving the international financial institutions alone. We have made a serious push, and I am very happy today that what started like it was, a contest between North and South, today everybody agrees that there is something fundamentally wrong about the global financial architecture. And everybody has agreed that we need reform. And we are not going to leave it there. We are going to take it to the next level. Kenya, for example, is participating with Germany, with France, and Colombia, and Barbados on that reform. And we are going to bring in ideas on a couple of things. Number one, we are going to bring ideas on debt management. How do we increase the tenure of debt? How do we increase the grace period of debt? And how do we have clauses that prevent or that support African countries whenever they are in trouble? How do we have debt pause clauses, for example, and many other avenues? Number two, how do we promote responsible credit rating? How do we responsible foreign sovereign debt? How do we promote it? How do we make sure that the credit rating agencies do their job without bias? How do we make sure that assessment of risk is not biased? How do we make sure that debt sustainability is not biased? These are ideas we're going to put on the table. We think that we've gotten the short end of the stick for too long, and it is because we didn't step forward with our own ideas, our own suggestions, and this time round we are saying we are putting our best foot forward.
Very insightful indeed. It was Dr. William Ruto addressing the debt crisis on the African continent. Now, I'll take this next question to you, Mr. Engineer Elvis. Now you've listened to the Kenyan president, who expressed the need for reforms in terms of Africa's financial architecture, equally said that credibility needed to be given to these institutions, while asking African leaders to, evoke how they can be able to get, debts, and they are not biased. Now, in your opinion, how could you quickly comment on that reaction from the Kenyan president?
I think I picked up about 3 things from what he said. The first, I think we already mentioned it here in our own conversation here, the issue he mentioned on debt management. You see, and I think it links up to the second point, which is assessment. People, we have a problem across the African continent because that we had earlier mentioned here already. Loans are given to people, or should I say loans are attributed to the wrong projects. Projects that are of no priority, projects that cannot benefit the people per se. But if they could take time to evaluate projects, take time after granting the loan to come back and do some sort of evaluation to see how far these loans were actually implemented or invested into the projects for which they were given, I want to think it would be a great leap forward. Because like I say, it boils down to one thing: accountability. It is not because a country calls itself a sovereign state that once you give them money and they mismanage, you cannot go back to them to be able to evaluate. After all, I want to think that in the world of finances, that's how it happens. That once an institution is giving you a loan, they have the right, I think, to come in and evaluate to be sure that you are doing it the right way, because they will need that assurance, that guarantee that they can get back their money. But if you give people money who go and they mismanage, they embezzle, sometimes they don't even invest at all, and you cannot come back to do some sort of follow-up, and then the next time you are still granting them more of those loans again, I think it is a serious problem. Secondly, he mentioned something about the issue of bias. You see, at this particular point in time, I would not want to limit it to Africa, but I take it now to the Western world. You see, I think that so far when he speaks, I think he speaks from experience and from experience. You see, African countries generally are not often given the same degree of treatment and consideration like it is done with the Western parts. It takes us back, for instance, to the issue of the Security Council at the level of the UN, when you realize that an entire continent like Africa does not have a single veto power at the level of the UN. I mean, an entire continent, over 54 nations, they don't have one voice at the level of the UN, as opposed to independent countries and not continents that can decide at any moment on anything, and it is implemented that way. It comes back to the same thing in the field of finances. And so I want to just somehow, for now, appreciate the efforts of what some of these African leaders are doing, and to see if they can continue to push forth the buttons to ensure that Africa is recognized as a 50-50 partner whenever she is going out there to trade with the outer world. Then I think it will be great. And the one thing I would have loved for the African leaders, because President Ruto said something, that Kenya is working with, I think he said some countries, France, Colombia, and the others. I would have even wished that it should not be an issue of an independent African country going out there to work with those countries, because I often like to remind that when you are going out as Kenya to face France, remember that you are discussing with France, but France is discussing with you based on what the European Union has set, and she cannot go beyond that or out of that framework. So I want to think that Africans need to do the same thing. If the AU were serious, they also put in place their own framework, their own principles, and they will now tell any African country, if you are going out there to discuss this with any European country, know that there are certain boundaries you don't go out of. You see, and by so doing, I want to think, therefore, that each time you are going out or a nation is coming in for business, they will always understand that in reality, at the background, it is a matter of maybe the European Union versus the AU, and not just necessarily the European Union through a particular country faced with a particular independent African country that is battling on its own. And the last thing I simply do not agree with is when they give us that impression that African countries are always into problems and so need assistance. We are into problems sometimes because of bad governance, you see, and our leaders too need to do everything to take away that shame from us as a continent. We have all it takes, and it is all what we have that has made Europe what it is today and continues to make Europe what it is. So they should stop trying to give that impression that Africa is always at the begging end, when in reality, we are the ones pumping out all what makes the other nations what they are.
Exactly. Africa is the mother of the world. Now, to crown up this debate with you, Dr. FONGOD, now you've listened to your co-panelists. Do you agree entirely with him and the President William Samoei Ruto? And in your closing remark, what is the way forward?
Look, I do, and I think honestly that what is happening with Africa, as my brother said, will come to many as a shock that Africa really is not in that much trouble. We don't have that much depth issues. What we have is actually a governance problem. And then number two, the rest of the world has treated Africa as a loan shark. If you know anything about a loan shark never lends money to anybody, which is basically part of something called predatory lending. Nobody actually lends. A loan shark will never lend you money with the intention of you paying that money back. They make everything very difficult so you're not able to pay that money back. And the reason for that is because whenever you go to a loan shark, there's something called collateral. The loan shark basically wants to collect something for you, which is basically called a collateral, so that by the time you default on the loan, then they can seize that particular asset, or they can basically, that asset might be land, it might be natural resources, it might be whatever that you stake to be able to collect the loan. So the idea here is this, that we really need to be able to stay away from, just like my brother said, from if we are serious, and if you're really, really serious, the IMF, the World Bank should be a no-go area for any African. We have to basically start looking within Africa, and if there be any negotiations, that negotiations must be on an African front. It cannot be countries by countries. We have said that a million times. It cannot be countries by country. It has to be on an African front. And thirdly, if there was ever going to be a time in which Africa basically emerges out of this madness, we have to be able to look for ways in which we can have our own currency. If we have our own currency, we change the whole, especially when I take our own currency, I'm talking about one currency on the African continent where every country on the African continent uses that currency that is backed by gold, not just some fiat thing, a currency that is controlled by us on the African continent. And to those who are leading us, I want each and every one of them to understand this, that the entire world is not just watching Africa basically become a laughingstock on the world stage. The entire world is also mocking at them who are in power, who has converted the whole entire continent to become a laughingstock. The reality is this: what you think it's basically you enjoying and basically having this freedom of doing whatever you want to do at the expense of the entire continent, it's basically so sad, and it's so evil to you and the whole entire nations and the nations that you're running. We have to do better. We have to be Africans first. Think about Africa, think about the people that we're ruling, so that by the time we have whatever it is called help or aid or whatever, let projects be done, judiciously. Let us do what we're supposed to do and do so faithfully and be able to get our continent, out of this stalemate. We don't owe money more than anybody else around the world, but we are absolutely in dire situation more than everybody else. And that's where this debt to GDP ratio comes in. We have to do better.
Absolutely. Africa needs to do better. Thank you immensely, Dr. Stanley, for your contribution on today's edition of Talking Point.
Thank you so much for having me, Sharon, and thank my co-panelists for joining in, and thanks our viewers as well.
Thank you immensely, Mr. NJINE, for your contribution on today's edition of the show.
It's been a pleasure being part of the program. Thanks for inviting me.
Ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, thank you immensely for staying through with us on today's edition of Talking Points over your #1 Pan-African channel for you Media Africa. Today we were discovering parameters and tackling Africa's debt crisis. We believed you learned a lot from today's edition. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to stay in company of our programs.